I have two questions which I think will sharpen some of the discussion up here. The second, which will go last, is about your comments, Mark. But the first one is about the question of Vigara and tenure, which Rick first raised, and was a theme. It was on. Was a theme that ran through also Randy's and Jane's remarks. And the premise of Vigara, I think, was that tenure was the reason why teachers who were less effective were concentrated in high poverty struggling schools. And certainly there's a moral obligation to ensure, particularly in high poverty schools, that students are receiving the best teaching. The thing that always struck me about this was that if you look at high poverty struggling schools, you don't find the numbers of tenured teachers that you find in middle class schools. And in fact, the demographic profile of teaching in high poverty struggling schools is a constant churn of novice teachers who leave burnt out within the space of 3 or 4 or 5 years. And so if the problem really was getting rid of bad teachers and moving good ones in, then we should be able to do that in very short order in the schools which have these constant openings. But it seems to me that what's missing in that understanding, and what's missing in a lot of discussion, and is missing, in fact, discussion of tenure, because we think of tenure as an individual right, is the degree to which teaching is a social activity. So we think of teaching as a track sport where we have a number of individual people competing, when it's really like basketball, where it's a team sport where people really excel when they work together socially. And that the problem of high struggling, high poverty schools is the lack of the social networks, the lack of the culture, the lack of the support for teachers in a context where they face these greater challenges. And so if that's the case, then Vigara, to my mind, seems to be completely off track. And I just wonder if you would like to tell me I'm completely wrong, or I might have said something of insight there.
Let me comment on that a little bit. I see it partly as an issue of culture in high poverty schools. I also see it heavily an issue of structure, that there aren't mechanisms to really reward and try to keep the best of the best, who sometimes are right there on year one, even though they get better. So I think if it's a culture and everyone, works together and is nice and tries to help each other, I think teaching is so difficult. I think it is so complex. I think it is so nuanced that even with that, you're still going to have great variation. And what we don't do in education is much of a sort. We don't sort people well, where in other professions we do, as people go up the hierarchy or become partners or become tenured at the university level. So I don't think culture is going to change anything, but I think identification of individual contribution, reward for individual contribution, and a recognition that many of these teachers may indeed be could become terrific lawyers, or they could become terrific accountants, or they could do lots of professional work in other ways. But that complex, very complex work that takes place in the classroom, I don't think everyone can do it. And I think assuming that everyone can do it leads to the sorts of problems that Mark was talking about.
Mark?
I want to point out that when we were putting the my little tribe of people were putting together the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards years ago, I commissioned Gary Sykes and Lee Schulman to do a paper for us on how the other professions handle some of these issues of professional standards. And I discovered something that amazed me, and it's right on Jane's point. They're even worse than public education is at getting rid of people who don't perform well, if anything worse. They solve the whole problem up front. That is the big difference. We basically, most of the people who go to teacher education institutions in the United States go to universities which have a variety of entrance standards, but most of them are fairly low. I know of none, I shouldn't say it this way. In most of those universities, one gets into the teacher education institution, which is part of it, simply by virtue of having been admitted to the university, which is not true of most of the professional schools, right? So they're selecting from the upper ranges, education is selecting from the lower ranges. And what the data show is that in the United States, most of our teachers come from the lower half of the distribution of high school graduates going on to college, whereas in the top performing countries, they come from the top half of the distribution. So you can see, I think, between the work that Lee and Gary did and the reports from Jane and others, from the observations that I just made, that we don't handle this at the front. We have almost no screens up front for quality. And though we're no worse than the other professions on the other side, it is by then much too late.
Ready?
So,
Pull the mic in.
So I want to go back to something Jane said, because teaching is incredibly complex, and we do treat it like a blue-collar occupation, as opposed to an incredibly complex profession. And that actually, as a design mechanism, from the design point of view, is a huge problem initially. But there's another huge problem, which is that we actually treat schools and children as we don't treat children in schools the same way we treat others who go to other professions. We treat them in big buildings, in places that don't have enough money, kind of in a sardine-like way, and in a very routiniers kind of way as well. So you have both of these things, and we are trying here, and I think, Mark, on some levels, it was very intriguing when you say if tenure is a problem, then changing it is not the solution. So what we do is we're thinking about a firing mechanism to deal with how a much bigger problem. Mm-hmm. So I think so in that context, though, Leo, I think that there are things that, because we have the square peg and round circle issues on both sides. But I think there are things that we have learned that are actually have some potential here. One is that whether you look at career ladders I think whether you look at them in the way in which Mark talked about them or Jane talked about them, Rick and I have talked about them in different ways. There is a real role for career ladders and for real differentiation and trying to figure out how you incentivize that in schools. The second piece, and some of the best research I've seen recently, is that something that, frankly, I actually proposed over a decade, 2 decades ago maybe, on having things like internships and residencies in teaching. We're starting to see those urban residencies take hold, and the clinical work that teachers get either in their last year of preparation or their first year of teaching, those teachers have the kind of training or professional development, that kind of training and professional development really, really works. And so you can create a school that bakes in those things that's part of the culture of that school and hopefully the culture of that system. And the last two things I'll say is, we have actually seen that variability, and test scores have shown that as well, in that you see huge ranges on individual teachers who one year kids will get terrific test scores, and the next year, that very same teacher, kids will get terrible test scores. So the problem in terms of variability is that we're using the wrong measuring sticks for virtually everything. But there are some things that actually can be helpful to try to have less of a round, less of a circle and a square peg, but ways of actually dealing with what I think we're all saying, which is, how do you recruit, retain, support a cadre of great professionals to work with and to help all the students of our land.
Can I comment on that? Sure. I think there's an assumption.
Near the mic.
Sorry. I think there's an assumption in what you're saying, Randy, that I have a hard time accepting, and that is that everyone can do it.
Oh, I don't think, wait, let me just say, I don't think everybody can do it.
So how do we deselect?
So but I think that's where I think evaluation systems are really important, because I don't think everybody can do it. And I think that a lot of people actually self-select themselves out. I mean, the attrition in teaching is huge, and frankly, we lose a lot of people that we ought not lose, but we lose some people that we should, that realize it's not a good fit. But I do think, as many of you know, and you and I have had this conversation on different panels, that we have to have fair evaluation systems that are transparent, that are viewed as fair, and things like that. And I'm not saying that, and I think you're right about tenure being an important earned right. But ultimately, there's a big difference between throwing people the keys and saying just do it in these kind of complex skills where I think we do owe people and kids some real training, because I think that I don't think that you're born a good teacher. I think you become a good teacher.
And that's where we
That would
differ.
get in here.
If I can go back to your original question, Leo,
Yeah.
about Vergara. I was on a radio show, NPR show, with the president of the Broad Foundation at the time, who was a big champion of Vergara. And the host asked, what is the mechanism by which low-income kids get these weak teachers? And honestly, it was the most excruciating 30 seconds to listen to the response, because he could not get to the core issue, which is the existence of high poverty schools is what makes it difficult to attract teachers to certain schools, right? When we talk about hard to staff schools, and there are lots of different ways we describe it, but these are economically segregated schools. These are the most difficult schools to teach in, because you have the highest need students concentrated. You have parents who are not in a position to, help out and volunteer in class and be supportive in the number of ways that families in middle class schools can. And then you have, and so therefore it's very predictable that you have teachers flee, experienced teachers flee. And I remember talking to one teacher in Hartford who was at a magnet school, an economically integrated magnet school, and she said the biggest reason she left a high poverty school is she didn't have a core of colleagues, which I think is your point, Leo, from whom she could learn, because there was so much instability. So that's why I said earlier, I wish the Broad Foundation, rather than supporting the Vergara approach, we're trying to address this underlying issue. We don't have to have large numbers of high poverty schools in this country. We are still barely a middle class country in which you could have many more opportunities for low income students to attend these middle class schools. And to my mind, that's the underlying question that Vergara kind of accidentally raises, is why do we have this system of economically segregated schools in the first place?
Okay, let me go to the second question. So Mark, it seems to me that the problem of public faith in teachers is not separable from the problem of public faith in public education, and that insofar as one can track a lack of or decline in faith in teachers, it follows a decline in faith in public education. And what's very interesting when you analyze this is that as the public school student population becomes blacker and browner and yellower, there is a drop of confidence, not across the public, but in white public. So when you disaggregate, and this work has been done, when you disaggregate confidence in public education, you'll find that it's smallest in older white males, and that in some ways it is actually growing marginally among younger people and among people of color. And I think that's also a reason why there's some of the intensity around public education issues, because in some ways what's happening around public sentiment and public education matches political polarization in the society at large. And so I think if you really want to understand what's happening with teachers, you need to understand that piece. The adversarial nature of, if you want, labor relations in K-12 education is not simply a result of taking on the framework of the National Labor Relations Board. It is also a result of taking on the framework of American law, which is adversarial. And I can tell you, as someone who, as a teacher unionist, negotiated these things, and I'm sure Randy has similar experiences, that one of the most frustrating things about negotiating evaluations, teacher evaluations, is that you have district lawyers who see themselves as prosecutors and union lawyers who see themselves as defense attorneys. And for those who are trying to talk about a evaluation system that's focused on helping teachers improve, the two of them think that the most important question is how many teachers are dismissed in the process. And so the reason why things like peer review are not much broader than what they should be is not because of union advocacy, but because people on the district side see questions of teacher evaluation as management rights and see peer review as the introduction of teachers taking over management rights. So I think all of those things are crucial pieces in terms of breaking down this sort of adversarial framework which governs it. And I think teacher unions have for some time, we don't have any particular allegiance to 1930s, NLRB, NLRA labor framework, but we're facing these other obstacles in terms of moving towards a different system that focuses on teacher professionalism.
You've raised quite a few issues. Let me see if I can deal with a few of them. All of this is, of course, absurdly complex. And in conversations like this, we can only have a conversation if we oversimplify almost everything. So that's kind of a ground rule. But having said that, I framed the issue the way I did deliberately with respect to your first point. That is, I pointed out that the cost of educating kids in this country per student has more than doubled. It's actually close to 250% increase over the last 20 or 25 years after accounting for inflation. That's got nothing to do with white males. It's got nothing to do with minorities. It's got nothing to do with who's young and who's old. It's a fact. And if you look at what motivated both Democrats and Republicans to vote for No Child Left Behind, which was an extraordinary thing in the circumstances, the Republicans had to hold their nose when a Republican president was talking about the federal government virtually taking over the nation's schools, which they had fought from Abraham Lincoln on down. And the Democrats had to hold their nose because they were signing a piece of legislation which would put them at odds with the teachers, which they had never been since they were Democrats. Right? Why did that happen? I think it happened for the reason that I suggested. So I will oversimplify, but I think not much. I think not much. I think the country, which had believed implicitly in its schools, thought that it had reason to be angry because they had put more and more and more money in and they were getting nothing out. So I'll stand by my statement. I think you can disaggregate all the polls you want to, and that fact still sits on the table like a great big elephant. On your second set of points, I don't know. To me, right now, and perhaps all I'm doing is repeating what I said earlier, you can get into the details of what the union's lawyers say and what the board's lawyers say in these conversations, and I am absolutely certain it is playing out exactly as you say. I have no reason to disbelieve that. It would be entirely consistent with my whole perception of what those conversations are about. But I will remind you that it's not just the board lawyers who are talking about measuring this in terms of getting rid of the teachers who aren't doing very well. Jane asked just, 15 minutes ago, what are you going to do about the teachers who aren't very good? This is a question that is not just on the mind of board lawyers. My own view of this, for what it's worth, is that part of the trouble that we're in now is because both the Bush administration before it, but also the Obama administration led with that question. They led with that question. And I think it's wrong to do that. It's morally wrong. I don't mean that the question is wrong. Yeah. I mean from a political standpoint and a moral standpoint and from a practical standpoint, it was a stupid thing to do. I don't mean to put too fine an edge on it, but it was stupid because if what you're trying to do is to get rid of the worst teachers, you have to ask yourself, who the hell are you going to replace them with? The people who were pushing that the hardest were making zero investment in answering the question, who would you replace them with? What the top performing countries have been doing, they haven't been paying any attention at all to the question of what do you do about the worst performers. They've been putting all of their effort into increasing the quality of their teachers across the board. And what have they found out? Something pretty simple. If you look at an American inner-city school serving mostly poor kids, you are likely to see a dysfunctional institution. You're likely to see rotten leadership. You're likely to see teachers struggling against a whole host of ills, and many of them, understandably, because it is a horribly hard job, give up. Some of them give up and leave, and some, unfortunately, some give up and stay. You can hardly blame them, but that's what happens. So I sit there and say, oh, good, so you're going to get rid of them? Really? You expect that school to look any different 10 years from now if that's all you're doing? Why? What you see in these other countries is entirely different. Not only are they making an enormous effort to improve the skills of all the teachers who are on the job in the ways that I was very briefly describing earlier, but you cannot move up the career ladder in Shanghai unless you have served in the kinds of schools I was just describing. You can't. You cannot go and teach in a suburban school in a really nice, cushy place with lots of money. You have to show that you have served in an inner city school or a far rural school and done a really good job there before you get that chance. They figured out how to use the career ladder to address this problem.
Randy?
I just, and I know there's other questions that probably people want us to answer, but I think we all mistake the problem if we don't actually understand that it is a both and. What Rick said about poverty and the changes in terms of American society, the increased segregation, the deindustrialization, the hollowing out of communities, the 30 years of hostility towards government and towards institutions, all of this plays its role as well.
Yep.
And so, and you know, and now, what's happened is that schooling actually becomes even more important today as a social institution.
That's right.
Than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago, and particularly in the places that we're talking about in inner cities, or in a place like McDowell County, West Virginia, where we're spending a lot of time trying to turn around outcomes. So I think that what happens is it just shows the complexity of it's not an either or, and I do agree with you that by leading with the question of, you know, all one has to do is fire some teachers, we took what is a really complicated, important, relevant social, moral principle of educating our kids and constrained it to something that became a question that, frankly, is pretty irrelevant, particularly in light of, not that we have to, not irrelevant in that, of course, if somebody can't teach, they should not be there. But in the big macro scheme of things, if we don't do things the way in which the countries that outcompete us do, then we'll never actually solve this problem, because the problem is one where we have a lot of kids, and we have to actually have a lot of really good people doing really good things.
Rick, do you want to say something?
I just want to add one footnote, because Mark, you mentioned a couple of times this problem where we've increased spending dramatically and the results haven't changed much. And you know, Richard Rothstein looked at that issue a number of years ago and found that much of the increase in spending was because we now adequately educate special education students, and so I think it's, and you were drawing a political conclusion rather than
That's correct.
An educational one, but I just wanted to add that caveat because I didn't want people to leave with the impression that we were massively inefficient in our spending, or we've grown much more massively inefficient than in the past.
We have.
Not to say we couldn't do a lot of things better, and I love the fact that you've brought the discussion around to career ladders, and I know that that's something that you worked with Al Shanker on many years ago. The National Board was the beginning of that effort, and we've got a long way to go on that.
Okay. We have 2 questions that came in. Is there another one there? 3? Let me do this all together and then let each of you comment on what you want and conclude so that we don't go on much longer. First question, as a former director of a teacher tenure office in what was a pro-union state, I often observed that administrators were dismissive or lazy in keeping track of teachers they found lacking or guilty of bad behavior, so that some of the most egregious cases were not solid. Comments? To discuss the issue of teacher selection. Don't we actually have a robust selection process in the metropolitan DC area where districts use higher salaries, school climate, and things like peer review in Montgomery County to attract and retain better teachers? Jane advocated for delaying tenure and using it very selectively to reward the very best, while Richard and Randy spoke at length at protecting the tenure rights of teachers. But if these rights are so important, how can we protect these rights for first, second, and third year teachers, especially if we delay tenure? So take up whatever of those issues you want. Mark?
Well, let me just take a shot at the first one. The author of, I forget which question this was, not the first, the question about teachers in this area of the world assumes that because there's competition among the various districts in the Washington, D.C. area, they are therefore hiring very good people as teachers. I actually don't see the connection. And I'd actually love to know how the author of that question measures the quality of the teachers that they're hiring. I will make in this connection one point. A few years back, we did a study of what the typical first-year community college program, credit-bearing courses, demands of high school graduates who are admitted to those programs in terms of mathematics and English literacy skills. And what we discovered, we selected a bunch of states at random. Within them, we selected a bunch of community colleges at random. We quickly discovered that almost everywhere the most difficult math course these kids face is a course called college math or college algebra. We went and asked the teachers of that subject in those institutions for their textbooks, and we analyzed the content. We asked the teachers in those institutions to share the textbooks in the occupational and general prep courses, college prep courses, with us, and the work that they assigned to the students that was graded. We got graded work from them. What we discovered was the following, that the college math and college algebra courses contained no algebra 2. They were almost entirely algebra 1 topics. And most of the kids coming from the high schools couldn't do the math. Algebra 1 in most school districts is a course that's supposed to be taught in middle school. So what I'm telling you is you didn't need any high school math to be successful. And the kids were struggling with middle school math. When we looked at the college textbooks, they were written at the 12th grade level. Many of the instructors told us that they had to prepare PowerPoints to sum up the gist of what was in the textbooks, because otherwise these high school graduates could not read them. We asked Catherine Snow and our other advisors about these matters why that would be, and they told us that that is because most high school textbooks are written at the 7th or 8th grade level. Most American teachers come from the bottom half of the distribution of high school graduates going to college. That is to say, if you take the whole conversation, what I just told you, and you put it all together, what that's telling you is that most of the teachers coming into our schools, this is certainly true at the elementary level, but on average it's true at all 3 levels, are coming out of school having no more math than a very poor command of middle school math. Because at least at the elementary school level, they get no more math. When we asked the community college instructors about the absence of writing in the assignments they gave to the kids, they said, we don't give writing assignments because the kids can't write. And we don't view it as our responsibility to teach them to write. I could go on. I want the person who asked that question to show me what he actually knows about what these teachers know and can do. The fact that there is competition among these districts doesn't mean that they're getting teachers of the same quality that they have in Shanghai and Finland.
Jane?
Just a little bit about...
Mike?
Yes, hello. A little bit about DC and Project Impact, which was basically an effort to change the human capital structure of the DC teaching profession. And the work was originally done through Calder, so I know it pretty well, was in the room when it was being negotiated, and it showed a big impact on recruitment. I'm not so sure it's competition either with Montgomery County, because I think DC is now recruiting nationally and paying for it. And one of the effects of Project Impact was higher retention rates among the most accomplished teachers and higher resignation rates among the lower performing teachers. Very few teachers were asked to actually leave, but just putting that pressure in place and just designing a structure, a management structure that gives more reward to your most productive people and less and more pressure on your less productive people, I think help sort out that selection mechanism, and it works the way you want it to work.
Okay. Randy?
Let me just,
sure.
the research also ended up last year being, was done by Tom D. and Jim Wyckoff, and it ended up being the award-winning paper of the American Public Policy and Management Association last year. So it's really gone through lots of reviews.
Randy?
So I've actually read that research. I don't actually get the same results from it as one of the people who negotiated the compensation package. I mean, but I do think actually underlying this is, what does Finland do? What does Singapore do? Shanghai, I think, is a different situation because also of the governance issues in China, and I think we have to actually think about that as well. But in Finland, they actually look at both the profession as well as the institution as public education as really important, and they make it really important, and that's part of the reason why people are, where people are. There's a lot more kids who could have had a lot of other opportunities that go into teaching and stay in teaching. The attrition rate is almost negligible.
Right.
And what we're also seeing, though, is, that this kind of narrative about teacher prep programs have been going on for a long, long time. TFA was supposed to be an antidote to that. But TFA, where you have people who presumably have higher GPA scores, they're not doing much better. It's all basically flat. And I think that the issue becomes, how do we go back to kind of the first principles that we were talking about? And I think all three questions kind of get to that issue, which is, how do you make sure that tenure is not a cloak of incompetence, it's not an excuse for managers not to manage, it's not in the K-12 setting a job for life, but it is one of But it is not the big boogeyman of schooling. It is, we have to actually figure out how to evaluate teachers in a way that is meaningful. And I think that we have not learned how to do that. You know, we've gone from drive-by evaluations that I used to have for 20 minutes with a principal in a room to an evaluation by test scores, also which was not meaningful. We have to learn how to do that. And I would go back to some of the peer assistance programs that Rick started with, which had much more meaning to it. I'd go back to something that Jane said, which is, how do you really use this as a moment to really look to see if somebody can teach and can teach meaningfully. But we have to also do something that Finland, Singapore, Shanghai does, which is they really invest not only in the teacher infrastructure, but in the school infrastructure.
Rick?
I'll take the last question, not because I have a good answer to it, but rather because I think it underlines the tension here and the balance that we need to strike. So on the one hand, I like Jane's idea that we need a higher bar for tenure, that it should be meaningful, and that we want to give people enough time to demonstrate their capacity before we make the decision. On the other hand, I'm uneasy with the idea of a unprotected class of teachers that might be around for a number of years. And this issue came up actually in New York, where in New York they have created a middle category of teachers who are deferred on their question of tenure. And so I'm nervous about what happens with those teachers. So I'm just wondering if there's some sort of middle ground where we make sure that the tenure means something, that there's a high bar, that not everyone gets it, and at the same time that there are some sorts of protections in place for those who are kind of left in limbo for during that pre-tenure period.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll see you next month to talk about Rick's favorite topic,
The issue that I kept trying to interject.
race and class segregation in our schools.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. You're very welcome.